Asher met a group of about 100 students, from the third sem, and we had said, can you please try and make it a little interactive, because our students get, if it's a 2-hour session, they get a little restless and bored maybe. So she said, yeah, and so we were wondering, 100 students and interactive, how is she going to, what's she going to do? Then we saw the magic unfold. All the students were with her, and for 2 hours it was a lot of doing and throwing. It was very masterfully done in this very room. So it was quite something. We enjoyed it. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Neena Asher, who has a PhD from Columbia, and she is professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. She was department chair for the last 3 years, July to June 2014, July 2011 to June 2014. She is also an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Gender, Women and Sexuality Studies. And Neena writes in the areas of postcolonialism and feminism, globalization and multiculturalism, and of course Asian American studies in education. And she is here on a Nehru Fulbright Fellowship for her research project in education on the kinds of changes that have swept Indian education since liberalization. So, Neena is book review editor for the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education since 2007, and for 2 years, from 2007 to 2009, she was also book review editor for the National Women's Studies Association Journal, and she has served as a member of several national committees, and she was on the faculty of Louisiana State University, where she served as co-director of the Curriculum Theory Project from 2007 to 10. So after doing her MSW here, she left for the US 25 years ago nearly, and so she's a true, East-West. So we are trying to find out where she belongs, and of course, like a true post-colonial person, she claims hybridity, and like A.K. Ramanujan, she says she's the hyphen between Indo-American. So there she is. Everybody please feel free to talk to us about globalization and the rest, and all that. Dr. Neena.
Hear me, right? I see that some brave students are back after this morning. That's always encouraging. Thank you for showing up again. That's great. We actually got a little bit into the talk in the middle of that class. And thank you all also for being here. And once again, Manmala, thank you for the generous introduction. So I have rehearsed the talk, so I'm going to try and stick to about 50 minutes, I think, the limit. Okay. So thank you to the Azim Premji University for the kind invitation to visit, give a talk, spend time with students and colleagues as a guest of APU. And thanks especially to Professor Venu Narayan and Chief Operating Officer S. Giridhar for their generosity in terms of time, thought, and effort as we planned this week-long visit. It took lots of emails to figure out what would work and when. So I appreciate their patience. And also because they connected me with Professors Rajashri and Vishwanath. And my thanks to Professors Rajashri and Vishwanath for their time, thought, and effort in organizing the talk and various activities during my visit. It really has been such a treat. It's been such a blast. So, and also thank you for the invitation to come to Language, Mind, and Society that Professor Vishwanath, Professor Giri, and Jane Sahi, Professor Sahi teach. And I also want to acknowledge Sujata Puranik and colleagues in the administrative office for all the arrangements they've made to make my stay here so comfortable. So as Dr. Vishwanath already noted, postcolonialism, feminism, critical perspectives on multiculturalism, and decolonizing education work have been central to my scholarship, teaching, and service to the field as a South Asian woman academic based in the US Academy. And this year, thanks to a Fulbright Research Award and sabbatical leave from the University of Minnesota, I have the opportunity to spend extended time in India and expand the scope of my work by learning more about globalization in the context of an economically liberalized, air quotes, yes, India. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity. And I thank you all for taking the time to be here, especially post-lunch on a Friday afternoon. And I look forward to our conversation. So, and I apologize, usually I pace, as the students know well, but if I'm going to read the paper, I'm kind of going to have to hide here with the gizmo and the papers. So, by way then of beginning the discussion related to engaging identities and cultures in the dynamic context of postcolonialism, globalization, and all that, I share a brief vignette that illustrates the issues and questions with which I've been grappling as an academic and an educator. So, and this I first wrote in 2007, and it came out, the article in which I wrote it came out in 2009. So the reference is about 7 years ago. So on a research trip to Mumbai, India, where I was born and grew up, I was stunned to read newspaper articles that talked of many Indian students not knowing who Gandhi was. I wondered then, is this loss of history a mere 6 decades after the end of colonial rule, an indication that we are now in post-colonialism? Or does it reflect the recolonization of the East, succumbing to the lure of global capitalism and consumerism shaped by the West? And then that same summer, 7 years ago, teaching this graduate level course that I had designed for master's students in a pre-service program. So that course I had called Curriculum and Teaching in a Global Context, and I'll refer to it later on towards the end of the talk. I was stunned when my American students were telling me that they didn't know anything about the Vietnam War, and in high school they hadn't been taught anything about the Vietnam War, which is a phase of recent history, and the shadow of that war is very, very long in the US-American psyche even today, right? So what does it mean when we don't know our own histories, right? So, in the interest of time, necessarily the theoretical overview will be relatively brief. One could talk for hours. So postcolonialism and globalization in theory and in effect are inextricably intertwined. And various scholars have noted the ambivalent, intertwined relationship of the colonizer and the colonized, and the effects of the expansion of capitalist ideology and relations across the globe. Of course, the post-colonial situation is not identical in all parts of the world. Nonetheless, transnational forms of colonial oppression are controlled by the spread of Western imperialism through globalization of labor market, new technologies, and global financial markets. So for instance, in Arjun Appadurai's 1996 book, Modernity at Large, which now is almost 20 years old, nonetheless his analyses, I think, are germane, right? He discusses the production of locality in new globalized ways, and he has offered us some concepts such as ethnoscape, financescape, technoscape, mediascape, and idioscape. So for instance, ethnoscape, according to Appadurai, is the landscape of persons who constitute the shifting world in which we live. Bangalore knows this very well, where moving groups and individuals constitute an essential feature of the world and appear to affect the politics of and between nations to a hitherto unprecedented degree. The newspaper headlines with Mom and with Modi's visit to the US, and then Dasara on the other side, it just really serves as a freeze frame too. Technoscape is the global configuration, also ever fluid, of technology that now moves at high speeds across various kinds of previously impervious boundaries. Mediascape, I'm still with Appadurai, refers to the distribution of the electronic capabilities to produce and disseminate information, which are now available to a growing number of private and public interests throughout the world, and to images of the world created by these media. Financescape refers to the rapid, complex flows of global capital, and idioscape to the political ideologies of states and counter-ideological movements. So these scapes, construed as dynamic spheres of social, cultural, political, and economic influence that shape human interaction, are also useful in considering the multiplex, multiple and complex, hybrid identities and cultures, and the increasingly porous, oft-blurring locales of East and West today. So with this very brief framing, and I kind of elaborated a little bit on Appadurai, but one could elaborate also on the works of other scholars. I now will just make a quick leap, briefly, to what scholars in education are saying in the US, who are drawing on critical perspectives, right? So critical thinkers in the US education field have noted that the last 2 decades have been marked by individual monetary gain, often read as wealth and success, the facile virtual proximity afforded by digitization, the spread of Western-style capitalism and corporatization across nations, and the effects of escalating consumerism, debilitating economic collapses, and environmental depletion, all in a context of increasing global interdependence. They note that US education and schooling are being shaped today by the spread of high-stakes testing and privatization. In his essay, The Global War Against Teachers, Vijay Prashad, who actually is a historian, nonetheless his essay is quite compelling. He has discussed how the ruling class, in order to maintain its power, works to spread its particular ideology of capitalism and democracy, not only shaping discourses of national identity and security, but also silencing speech, including that of teachers, with the demand that they stick to the facts and not teach in ways that question the status quo. Mediocrity that maintains systems of consumption and production becomes the goal, not intellectual endeavor that interrogates, critiques, and revisions. And interestingly, yesterday at the Colloquium, Usha Ramanathan, I think, was the scholar presenting, and she talked about the discourses and practices around security that happening in India too today, which was, well, troubling and powerful learning for me. So, such issues are reflected in recent policies in India too. For instance, the 2005 NCF and the 2010 RTE, National Curriculum Framework and Right to Education, in an economically liberalized and post-colonial India. For instance, the 2005 NCF focused on the implications of, quote, globalization and the spread of market relations to every sphere of society, in terms of education in general, as well as specific content areas. As per the NCF, quote, a pedagogy that's sensitive to gender, class, caste, and global inequalities also locates these within larger structure of power and raises questions such as who is allowed to speak for whom, whose knowledge is most valued. So really, this consciousness, these issues have emerged in policy frameworks here too. Again, I haven't necessarily been studying Indian education, I recognize that. I did try to do some homework as I was preparing for the Fulbright, actually as I worked on the proposal, right? And also the RTE, the Right to Education Act, provides for free and compulsory education of all children in the age group of 6 to 14 years. And education has been declared as, quote, a fundamental right. But from the critiques that I read, the RTE, like the 2001 No Child Left Behind in the US, has also been critiqued as an unfunded mandate that's unregulated and that's being implemented in a context of privatization, right? And with student learning levels still remaining unacceptably low. Interestingly, this past Monday, the 22nd of September at the convocation, the Chancellor and founder of APU, Azim Premji, also mentioned the need to overhaul pre-service teacher education in India. So these are some of the issues and debates about which I know I shall learn more during my year over here and through our conversations. So I see this presentation as a beginning. So with this as the backdrop and framing, I now turn to questions of identity and culture in relation to education today, right? So the sort of 3 bullet points around which I've organized the rest of this paper. In what ways are globalization and corporatization shaping identities and cultures? In what ways can educators resist recolonization in terms of curriculum, teaching, teacher education, research, theory, discourse? What new hybrid forms of self-representation can we foster? So before I begin unpacking the issues that I think speak to these questions, I'll situate myself as a researcher. Vanmala already did that a little bit. So before proceeding with this discussion, I take a minute. As a US-based scholar of Indian origin who has studied and worked in both contexts for a long time now, I have deep knowledge of both cultures, cultures writ large, of course. At the same time, I recognize that my knowledge of the economically liberalized, globalized India is largely based on recent writings, scholarly and popular, media reports, and rather limited exposure during short visits. So situated between East and West in this paper, I focus specifically on and across the porous context or borders of India and the US. To this end, in the next section, I engage Akash Kapoor's 2012 documentary book, India Becoming a Portrait of Life in Modern India. Has anyone here read it? No? Okay. Which illustrates with nuance and insight so many of the issues germane to identity and culture in relation to postcolonialism and globalization, East and West, and all that today. And then in the final section, I turn to discussing decolonization and education. So India becoming incredible, shining, and tigerish too. I thought that that needed to be the subtitle. Economically liberalized India has gained the attention of the Western media in the 21st century. The India of the Raj is now replaced in the Western imagination by an India that is supposedly incredible and shining, you know, incredible India, India shining campaigns, right? And borrowing from Arvind Adiga's award-winning novel, The White Tiger, India is now tigerishly entrepreneurial. He doesn't say it like that, I'm saying it like that. Those of you who have read it know about the fellow who's the white tiger in it, who becomes an entrepreneur after having been a halwai in the India of darkness up north, right? Anyway, I've used his work in my classes, Adiga's book in my classes and in other papers. I won't spend tons of time here because here I found myself drawn to Kapoor's work for various reasons. So anyway, so while India is busy shining and incredible and entrepreneurial and all that, it's also an India which is struggling to emerge from a shameful history of caste-based oppressions and atrocities, and certainly from legacies of colonialism. India today, in the Western imagination, is home to Bollywood, brilliant tech expertise, and of course that remarkable transnational lifeline on which so many of us depend in this age of globalization, the call center, staffed, of course, with appropriately accented English-speaking young representatives, right? There's already literature, documentary films come out critiquing some of these phenomena. It's also depicted, India is also depicted as a nation in which women's rights lag behind and contestations around LGBT rights continue, even as India has now become the first nation to recognize a third gender officially, right? So the contradictions in the process of emerging from colonialism and histories of marginalization and discrimination. Of course, situated between East and West, I pause here now to turn my gaze for a moment on the West, specifically the US, where I have been working for over 2 decades. Debates around women's and LGBT rights and representations are also present in the US today, as are the continued struggles related to recovering from a shameful history of slavery and racism, right? So for instance, this is a fairly facile example, nonetheless, it's germane, I think. For instance, while Australia, as well as several countries in Africa, Asia, Central America, South America, and Europe have or have had women heads of state, the US and Canada have not so far, right? So while there are different strides different parts of the world make, it's interesting on what our gaze tends to fall. And the uphill battle to desegregate schooling continues 60 years after race-based segregation in public schooling was ruled unconstitutional in the US in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954. Okay, so now, turning now to Akash Kapoor's sensitively written India Becoming a Portrait of Life in Modern India, published in 2012 by Riverhead Penguin, captures many of the tensions, at times ambivalent and contradictory, of class, caste, gender, culture, and identity in an economically liberalized post-colonial India. Kapoor is himself biracial with transnational identifications and began researching and writing the book upon his return to India in the 21st century after having spent over a decade and a half in the US and the UK, so he was in the West. So one may read India Becoming as Kapoor's search for the home to which he thought or hoped that he would return. his effort through his researches, and primarily between, Bangalore, Pondicherry, Chennai. He lives somewhere near Pondicherry. I know all this, I don't know him, I know all this through his book, reading his book. So Kapoor seems to be trying to make sense through his researches of a country that seemed to be trying to become like America. I have the book and I'll hold it up later because even the cover is very interesting, but I'll just hold it up later on. So I want to note that in my paper, you can't see it right now, but I use America in quotation marks, particularly to underscore how it's used as synecdoche to refer to the US, which of course is just one nation in the Americas, South, Central, and North, right? So in his prologue, Kapoor noted, it was to this new nation, this country where fields were giving, now he's in the southern part of the country, where rice fields were giving way to highways, farmland to software complexes, saris to pants, that I returned in 2003. I was coming home, but in many ways it was to a home that I didn't recognize anymore. Through the stories of the people he featured in his book, I just found this online and I thought I need to put something in for a little bit of levity, post-lunch humor. So through the stories of the people he featured in his book, Kapoor reveals how globalization and corporatization are shaping identities, cultures, and geographies in an India that has forsaken socialism for capitalism, shrunk investment in farming, focusing instead on the tech sector and the global corporation, and opted to repurpose rural land, yielding instead to use Ashish Nandi's words for just a moment, the beckoning magic of the new colonial metropolis, which frames the mythic journey to the city. Indeed, India Becoming speaks eloquently to Appadurai's 5 scapes and the related implications for development and education in the context of India today. So for instance, Harsh, and Kapoor has used pseudonyms and all of that, okay? So for instance, Harsh, one of the people featured in Kapoor's book, who works at an American software company in where else, Bangalore, lets Kapoor know that he was reconsidering his original plan to work abroad. I'll give you a break from my voice, and can you read that in the back? Okay, you can see in the back, no? So I'll give you a break from my voice for a moment, you can read that. As Kapoor wrote about the more general movement towards meritocracy, away from a feudal and caste-based India, he also documented the perils, pitfalls, and pernicious outcomes of development. For instance, his descriptions reveal the anger of villagers, the ecological depredation, and the loss and despair of farmers as they lost not only their land, but also sources of livelihood and ways of being in the face of development that catered to those from the cities. For instance, Kapoor noted that while the East Coast Road between Chennai and Pondicherry had become a modern highway, convenient for city dwellers, it had also become the site of numerous accidents and fatalities among those living in the villages and communities in the region that had until recently been rural. They were not used to that kind of traffic whizzing by, right? So anyway, I see head nods, so I don't need to elaborate. And then Kapoor cites Purushothaman, another person he features, who sold land that his family had farmed for generations. And Purushothaman says, I slogged all my life on that land, and I only made a loss. To see a city fellow come in, put a little paint on some stones and make a fortune in 3 months, how do you think that feels? And there's a lot of that kind of ill feeling in the village, right? So, of this, presentation. So, Kapoor described the emerging national mythology that exalted entrepreneurship and the entrepreneur's lifestyle, that venerated capitalism and wealth accumulation in the same way that India had once venerated public service, end quote. Indeed, historian Dipesh Chakrabarty has remarked on, quote, a consumerist revolution occurring in India, noting that the, quote, politics of culture in India today cannot be separated from the presence of media and consumerism in Indian public life. So we can see how Chakrabarty, Appadurai, writing from their different locations, are raising some of the same issues. And yet it is this national shift in identifying with a culture of capitalism. So while there's the rich-poor divide is increasing, while there's displacement, it's this national shift in identifying with a culture of capitalism that has opened up opportunities for so many who may not have had access to them in past decades, right? So for instance, Kapoor talks about Hari, a 27-year-old man, originally from Tindivanam. I don't know Tindivanam, I only know it because Kapoor mentions it in his book. And Kapoor describes it as, quote, a market town about 120 kilometers south of Chennai, and, quote, a crowded, dreary place that he himself, Kapoor, knew, quote, mostly as a traffic jam on the way to Chennai. So Hari had left home at age 17, and when Kapoor met him, where was I? That outsourced research to India. We learn that Hari knew that he was different, that he didn't quite fit into his hometown. Kapoor wrote, he said that he had learned English from watching television and from reading books and pamphlets at his mother's, at his mother's workplace. From a young age, Hari was determined to be fluent. He knew that English was his ticket out of Tindivanam, right? So, as so many of us in or from India know so well, our relationship with and the use of the English language remains one of the contradictions with which we postcolonials live. That came up a lot in the class presentation today too. So professional success within India in transnational settings, and certainly in an area of global corporatism, is our gain, even as we may lose our own native languages and cultures. Frantz Fanon wrote clearly and eloquently in Black Skin, White Masks as early as 1952 about the effects of colonization on language, psyche, culture, and body. Fanon was from the French colony of Martinique, studied in France, and wrote Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, in the language of the Black Skin, White Masks, in the language of the colonizer, to critique the objectification of the black man as a result of the white man's gaze, right? So, returning now to India becoming, we learn later about another facet of Hari's difference. Hari is gay. Kapoor narrated that Hari returned to India after a stint for work in London with, quote, a clearer sense of his identity. Kapoor wrote, quote, we didn't have to talk about that thing or it or the way I am. Hari was able to call himself gay, to speak about himself as homosexual. So while Hari was on the one hand caught up in the lure of material culture, so much so that Hari was in great debt, tens of thousands of rupees in debt, because he was busy buying multiples of everything. Kapoor described, well, I'll show you the book later on. So anyway, so there he is, on the one hand, able to step out of the frame of heteronormativity or the limits of socioeconomic opportunities offered by Tindivanam, and then on the other hand, he's someone who's caught up in this material culture, right? So we see in India Becoming, we see Kapoor's book revealing perhaps stories and examples that speak to what a friend of mine, Greg Dimitriadis, described as the enabling and constraining dimensions of globalization, right? And the possibilities and challenges related to engaging the contradictions we encounter as we work to articulate hybrid identities, cultures, and self-representations. So the last bit, and it's actually a few pages, but to do with Kapoor's book that I want to, and I save the best for last perhaps, or perhaps the most significant for last actually, is around the stories of three women, Banu, Selvi, and Veena. And Kapoor draws out the tensions of balancing through these three stories. Really, he draws out the tensions of balancing at the fulcrum of village and city, yesterday and tomorrow, in the here and now of economically liberalized India. Kapoor wrote, okay, I'll let you read about Banu and as I get a sip of water. And so here Kapoor is featuring a woman, a person with whom he's had many conversations, and actually another character in the book, he's not in the paper, is Sati, who's Banu's husband, who's a landowner. And Banu and Sati live in different parts of southern India because Banu tried to live with Sati's family and all that. She liked the people, but she found village life and that rural life too limiting. So there she was shuttling with her kids and her family between Bangalore and outskirts of Pondi, if I'm remembering correctly. So really, he's done such a great job, the author, Kapoor, of getting into the lives and stories of these people. And I think it's very astute where he says that her modernity lay precisely in her confusion. So, I think there's food for thought in terms of gender and implications in terms of gender and globalization and what it's taking to, in terms of the fabric, keeping the fabric of society intact or intact even as it evolves, right? They didn't always know where they wanted to go. So these insights are germane to analyses articulated by postcolonial feminist scholars. For instance, Avatar Bra has written, and I think she writes out of the US, globalizing tendencies set in motion centuries ago acquire new meanings in a world characterized by the increasing dominance of multinational capital, the flexible specialization of labor and products, and the revolutionizing impacts of new technologies in production, distribution, and communication. The emergent new international division of labor depends quite crucially upon women workers, right? So another of the women Kapoor features is Veena, right? So Veena is, Veena, Selvi, and Banu are all different from each other. And it's very interesting, and I didn't have time to bring Selvi into the paper. I wanted a couple of examples. So there's Veena, whose life is quite different from Banu's, and let's see what struggles she has, right? So Veena is once divorced and living with her boyfriend in Bangalore, and she was astonished, Kapoor tells us, at her own success in working in the tech sector. She never really imagined she could make so much. She'd moved to Bangalore hoping she could improve her prospects, but she didn't think it would happen so quickly. She knew it was only money, but still, she said, it gave her a sense of accomplishment. The money is important because you need it, but also because in the end, it's a measure of achievement. That's the way it is. In a place like Bangalore, the kind of money you're earning tells where you are, and where you've reached, it gives you a kind of value, right? And she also spoke, Veena spoke with Kapoor about power and gender, right? Power is good, she said, laughing. I grew up with this very Indian concept that a woman doesn't do a lot of things. I grew up thinking that a woman was essentially less than a husband. So of course the power gives me a kind of high, knowing that I'm doing equally well or better than all these men, and knowing that they have to listen to me. She laughed again. She said, I know I probably sound power hungry, like one of those Western women in pantsuits you see on TV or whatever. Well, you can see I'm not like that, but still, sometimes when I watch them, I think they're onto something. While Veena seems to have broken through the mold of constraining gender norms inherited from the past, we see that she also faced nuanced struggles. For instance, Veena and Kapoor discussed the issue of having children, right? And here's what Veena says. It's complicated, she said. I'm actually very confused. You see, I have this little problem. If I have to I'm not a man. If I have a kid, I have to have it inside me. I can't outsource it. So really, I don't know what to do, right? It's interesting that the confusion falls on the woman, right? In this case, in a case like this. I like my job. I'm still learning. I still have place to move up. If I quit now before I'm at my full earning potential, then I won't earn as much when I come back. So India Becoming reveals the opportunities, the individual and corporate success stories within and beyond the borders of the nation, as well as the struggles, challenges, and losses experienced in the context of globalization and economic liberalization. The insights India Becoming yields speak to issues of identity and culture in terms of gender, culture, class, SES, region, nation. So in conversation with Vinod Shetty, who is a Mumbai-based lefty lawyer, well, Kapoor puts it more elegantly, leftist labor lawyer, an activist, Kapoor realized that one man's freedom was another man's prison, citing for instance, India's tech industry as a shining success story. Kapoor also noted that the tech industry employed only a little over 2 million people in a nation of more than 1 billion, right? We were talking about the panopticon earlier with some students in class and after lunch. Anyway, Kapoor wrote, the same economic path that set in mind that in so many minds had unleashed India, set it on a trajectory to self-sufficiency, to Vinod, the labor lawyer, marked a kind of national enslavement. The nation's reforms, he told me, had started the mortgaging of India. He said he'd seen what happened to other countries that followed the diktats of the IMF and the World Bank. They became, in his view, neo-colonies, right? We may recall that British colonial rule in India grew out of the establishment of the East India Company, which was launched as a trading company in 1600, and it came to rule large parts of India. So globalization, colonialism, and all that, in some ways is old hat. In which case, what's different in the 21st century India, or in 21st century US, or 21st century West? The scale and the speed, the widespread reach of uneven change, of consumerism's duping and insidious lure, even as access to technology affords great convenience to the individual consumer, vendor, student, teacher, and citizen. So for instance, with reference to multinational retailers overtaking traditional bazaars, for instance, like vegetable vendors, vegetable markets, right? Vinod discussed with Kapoor the inevitability of, quote, unemployment for small traders across the nation. What was the use of efficiency, he asked, if it put millions of people out of work? Shouldn't the main objective of economic reforms of any economic policy be to provide employment and livelihoods to its people? So perhaps at the heart of India becoming a portrait of life in modern India is the question of, quote, the sobriety and moral purpose of a country before it succumbed to the bland homogenization of 21st century capitalism, as Kapoor notes in concluding his prologue. Of course, the question of purpose, of the identity and culture of a country or a civilization at its core, at its heart, has also been central to the work of generations of scholars, activists, educators, community organizers, cultural workers, and others in battling colonial and economic exploitation, racism, casteism, patriarchy, and the need to focus on the social good over individual and corporate greed for many decades now in many parts of the world. So we know that. There's a ton of discourse, ton of NGOs, other efforts, schools, centers, we know that. There are friends, we have friends, right? Parenthetically, I note that as I have prepared this talk over the last few months, I have felt aware of the unique, or at the very least extraordinary, situatedness of Azim Premji University. This is my first time here this week, because the existence of APU straddles perhaps the best of both corporate success and a commitment to enduring grassroots-driven education and development, as Gloria Anzaldúa, or to borrow from Gloria Anzaldúa's notion of a mestiza space, a hybrid space, a mestiza space that could perhaps serve as a model for such work in other locales, I don't know. I'm simply saying that these are thoughts that have run through my head. Over the decades, as a teacher educator in the US, I have raised these issues in relation to the US context, not only in graduate seminars. Graduate seminars are a different deal. We get doctoral students who might have come in with more life experience than typically the masters and undergrad students do over there. In education, they come with somewhat more of a critical frame in general as compared to the pre-service teacher ed students who are barely venturing out after high school into undergrad programs, right? I have also raised these issues in the required core multicultural undergrad courses. People who were present in the morning session heard this from me. And I didn't spend time in this paper. I've written elsewhere, and I can give you those citations if you're interested at all. But how there's a great deal of resistance to these required multicultural ed courses, and what it takes to teach those courses, what the implications of offering and not offering them. So time and again, especially in the undergrad classes, in the elementary ed, teacher ed programs, the students who are typically at the big state universities, they are young white women for the most part, and they come from small towns with limited exposure to diversity and multiculturalism. They're kind of scared. And usually the person teaching these classes is usually like a person of color, usually a woman of color, right? I don't like saying minority, I prefer person of color in the US context. And interestingly, these students who are kind of skittish about engaging, and you really have to work to finesse it, to draw them in, and anyway, but while they're skittish about engaging race, maybe, gender, sexuality in some ways, maybe, when it comes to global corporations, interestingly, many of them from small towns, they have witnessed the loss of livelihood in their own families and communities as Walmarts or any of the big juggernauts came in and took away family businesses. So to that, they can relate somewhat sympathetically, you know? So it's interesting too how the critical perspective is like partially adopted, right? So, so corporate colonization, in addition to being old hat here in India, is also old hat there in the West. So what gives? What gives? What lessons are we forgetting or simply not learning, and why? And what can we do in terms of education work to emerge from colonization, old and new, here and there, right? So this brings me to, if I'm keeping up with the slides, then yes, then the last section, Decolonization and Education, Thoughts on Curriculum and Pedagogy in an Era of Globalization. This section is kind of three rather not entirely loosely put together subsections, but the first part of this section is offers some theoretical issues, or considerations or recommendations. The second part is a vignette from my own teaching, from my own pedagogical efforts and the challenges I encounter, right? Because it's wonderful to have critical thought about we can do this and build these coalitions. We need that discourse. How do you translate that discourse into practice and what it takes and what happens when you find you're not quite succeeding, right? And then I conclude with some thoughts from, on continuing, on persevering, that I draw hard from some of the postcolonial feminist scholars there. So those are kind of the three bits under here, right? So, the detailed documentation that Peter Taubman presents in his book, it was another award-winning book, like Adiga's was an award-winning book, Teaching by Numbers, Deconstructing the Discourse of Standards and Accountability in Education. Taubman speaks to the deleterious effects of such commodification and corporatization in the present-day US educational context. For instance, Taubman argues that the audit culture, shaping the discourse and practice of accountability has led to what he calls a loss of ideals, such as racial integration and economic equity. And according to Taubman, it fosters in teachers a kind of melancholia, noting that education now, quote, consists of preparing for constant job retraining, all those 21st century skills, end quote. Taubman asks, let's see what he asks. How did we allow the language of education, study, teaching, and intellectual and creative endeavor to transform itself into the language and practices of standards and accountability? How did it happen that we approved the use of pervasive testing that would shock us into compliance? How did we become complicit in the erosion of our own power? And why did we embrace the advice of salesmen, financiers, corporate lawyers, accountants, and millionaires? What led us to think that if we applied practices imported from the world of business, we could solve our educational problems? And how did we surrender our right to define those problems? How did we lose our way? Right? He's speaking to an audience in the education field, right? So interestingly, just like with Kapoor's book, here we come up against the question once again of moral purpose. With reference to the US context at least, perhaps it's because, it is because the single-minded pursuit of capitalism has overshadowed the commitment to a true democracy in the US. Successful entrepreneurship on the part of individuals, read becoming multimillionaires and billionaires, forget becoming millionaires, who cares, right? No, just a million. I mean, if these are the goals we are offering, right? So if successful entrepreneurship trumps an engagement with strengthening a society of the people, by the people, for the people, it follows then that the private outstrips the public, the individual eclipses the social, the common, the communal. And now in the era of globalization, much of the rest of the world, or so it seems, has bought into this capitalist enterprise. It is this capitalist enterprise that requires us, even in educational context, to produce and consume tangible products, for instance, standardized tests. judge achievement and progress by means of measurable, quantifiable outcomes, for instance, scores on standardized tests, and to come up with quick fixes to boost performance, that are supposed to boost performance and productivity. In the US context, for sure, NCLB, No Child Left Behind, or more recently, Race to the Top, right? It is this enterprise, then, that keeps us, students, teachers, administrators, occupied with tasks that take us away from deep thought and foundational work. For instance, if we just think of people being on tenure track, faculty being on tenure track at research universities in the US, these days it's all about grants. So if somebody is really cogitating on a really, really powerful manuscript or notion, whatever their field might be, what happens to allowing for that kind of work to emerge, you know? So anyway, so it's this enterprise, this capitalist enterprise then, that takes us away from deep thought foundational work, from critical self-reflection and contingent analyses, from cultivating the ability to read the world critically, from building community to achieve such goals as equity and justice in school and society. So I'll cite just briefly a few scholars and the suggestions they have offered. The suggestions sound delicious. They sound fabulous. The struggle is to realize those in enduring ways. It's not that efforts are not happening in big and little ways. Having great wealth, like the founder of this university does, and pouring it into creating a university like this is one thing. How do we do this, have a vision and implement it, and realize it in meaningful systemic ways, right? I don't know that I have the answer. I certainly have the question, right? So Noel Goff, who writes out of Australia, recommends, for instance, quote, building transnational coalitions for public education that critically and creatively translate, adapt, and expand national democratic ideals into international educational purposes. Nothing to argue there, and except somebody may say, whose national democratic ideals, which is a question worth raising, but anyway. So, reflecting the temper of the times, Goff urges curricularists to bear in mind that they need to prepare, quote, future labor for a global economy and citizens for an international polity. And he suggests to this end that we think in terms of both continuities and changes in the socio-technical systems that produce curriculum work, as well as in the diverse publics for which such knowledge is produced across national borders. Eric Shepard and Richa Nagar urge us to engage, quote, in collaborative work with one another and students and educators, and one another and with students, with educators in our local schools and communities, and with actors located in the global south who most directly experience the downside of neoliberal globalization. And I'll skip a few. There are a few more such, but you get the gist. So people have some thoughtful, critical suggestions, right, about the directions in which we should go. There are some that are more directly specific to the US, but whatever, we'll skip those. So while these analyses are pertinent to rethinking teacher education, practice-based analyses in research literature rarely appear. It's hard. How do you do this kind of micro work and then generate like work that has large-scale impact? It's a challenge, right? So remember at the outset that vignette, and I mentioned the master's level course I created, Curriculum and Teaching in a Global Context, right? So I mentioned earlier this morning too, there's a collective working out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, up north, Midwest US, the Rethinking Schools folks, it's teachers and others, and they've produced a lot of very good literature that's practice-based, that's useful, especially like for pre-service teacher education. And I've used several of their works in my classes, especially the required undergrad courses or the required master's, pre-service master's courses, right? So one of their books is Rethinking Globalization, and it does a good job. The articles are written typically by teachers, and they are not like this. They are not full of theoreticities. They come out of, they have good critical ideas, and they are written by practitioners, often for practitioners. So these work really well, supported with other texts in my pre-service classes, right? So such issues as global interdependence, consumerism, the implicated of the West and the elite classes, the socioeconomically privileged, in relying on child labor in the third world and so on and so forth. These works are very useful in bringing out these issues, right? The last time I taught this course was in the summer of 2010. After that, in 2011, I migrated to Minnesota. So that time, we had in class 35 students. 1 was an African-American woman, 3 were multiracial women of color of Central or South American heritage, 30 were white women, and 1 was a white male. So really, 31 out of 35 were, in terms of race, part of like the dominant culture, right? So we began engaging Paulo Freire's notion of conscientization, the concept of unlearning us and them binaries, and I always substantiate these concepts with practical examples, right? And began talking about arriving at in-between spaces so that we might recognize and build upon commonalities and differences. The students are able to work with these ideas with some support, so that's not bad. But then, one of the articles in Rethinking Globalization talks about how the US is one of the only 2 member nations of the UN. The other nation is Somalia. These are the only 2 nations that have not ratified the UN Children's Convention protecting the rights of the child. The resistance to that in these classes is tremendous. The students will, oh, it could be the way the document is worded. We don't understand why it would be. The US is ultimately not, they can't fathom that, right? Yeah. And so it has to be the document that is such that this country can't support it, right? To even begin considering that perhaps the US is interested actually in keeping things the way they are rather than ending the exploitation of child labor is something that the students don't come to grips with. Okay, so this is one example of the kinds of challenges, even through all the critical pedagogy, all the hard work, right, that I've encountered, but truly, in all honesty, without being grandiose and overly ambitious, one cannot count on one 15 to 16-week course to bring about lasting change in every student enrolled. And with reference to the education field, Anne Hickling-Hudson, Julie Mariko Matthews, and Annette Woods, these are scholars who are like me from different parts of the world, and now they're based in Australia. So they note that contemporary conditions of neoliberal capitalism have made for a limited conception of educational change and transformation. And I have argued that multiculturalism in the US remains within a frame that situates, quote, the white, Western, heterosexual, upper-class individual at the mythic center, and others, queer, ethnic, or in some way different, in their designated marginal locations. Although multicultural education courses are now regularly required as a part of the teacher-ed curriculum in the US, and the language of multiple perspectives and cultural relevance is widely used, stereotypic representations of diverse others persist in schools, classrooms, texts, and communities. Okay, so that said, I think our only recourse is to continue to persevere in our efforts, as Gayatri Spivak has put it, of righting wrongs, right? And whether that's in terms of theory, research, practice, policy, and how can we do it in thoughtful and recursive ways? Of course, I have the final word on it. No, I don't. But I have some thoughts. There's no final word that I can ever come up with, I don't think. But towards transformation, rethinking discourses and differences. Audre Lorde, in her widely cited essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, in 1984, reminded us that we need to recognize difference as a crucial strength. In the 3 decades since, a number of postcolonial feminists, Gloria Anzaldúa, Bulbeck, Connell, Mohanty, Rousseau Torres, Trin Minha, Chris Whedon, well, not all of them identify themselves as postcolonial feminists, but one way or the other, they've written about postcolonialism. They have made significant contributions in terms of engaging difference. For instance, in a highly influential essay, Under Westernized, Feminist Scholarship and Colonial Discourse, Chandra Mohanty argued for the need to critique the colonizing hegemonic discourses, and this was in 1991, long ago. She argued for the need to colonize hegemonic discourses of Western feminisms and at the same time address, quote, the formulation of autonomous, geographically and historically and culturally grounded feminist concerns and strategies. And in developing the powerful concept of a mestiza consciousness, Chicana Tejana feminist poet and writer Gloria Anzaldúa reminded us, the struggle is inner. Chicano, Indio, she's referring to natives, indigenous. American Indian, Mojado, Mexicano, immigrant Latino, Anglo and power, working class Anglo, Black, Asian. Our psyches resemble the border towns and are populated by the same people. The struggle has always been inner and is played out in the outer terrains. Awareness of our situation must come before inner changes, which in turn come before changes in society. Nothing happens in the real world unless it happens in the image, first happens in the images in our heads. And Kelly Oliver, who is actually engaged with Frantz Fanon's work, noted that decolonization also entails, along with large-scale resistance movements, quote, psychic revolts that take place in the everyday lives of ordinary people who resist domination. So the work is both outer/systemic and also inner/psychic. Therefore, critical self-reflexive scholars, educators, and cultural workers in multicultural, globalized 21st century contexts need to continue to critique historical and extant relations of power, validate multiplicities within and across contexts, remain open to contradictions and engage ambivalent tensions, and engage discourses and pedagogies in relation to context. Such perseverance will contribute to fostering equity and justice in contexts of rapidly evolving identities and cultures here and there. Thank you.
Something of a parallel situation when I was teaching in the State University of Bangalore, where Bangalore University is one of the first universities to open its doors to, OBC and other castes and classes in this area, in Karnataka state. And therefore, when, there have been other diversity of students, there's a lot of resistance from within the system itself, as well as from the students, for bringing about change. No, it's not enough to provide, reservation, but we need to make education also accessible through the curriculum and through our discussions, and make it a more, habitable space for a diversity of students. When that was the challenge, there was resistance from inside. So how did you address that particular thing in terms of colleagues and the system itself at the level of curriculum, let's say?
Yeah, you can hear me? Do I need a mic? Well, couple of things. One is, and this, I can't take credit for this. The master's program that colleagues had set up at LSU by the time I was hired as an assistant prof, one of the things they did was they built in autobiography. And when we allow students a chance to, and you offer confidentiality, etc. But when we offer students a chance to write their autobiography, their story, one is we get a better sense of our diverse students, or even if they don't appear diverse, there's diversity within them, So one is that. Maybe I should wear my little gizmo again. It's just the heat. But, two is, it lets us, allows us to get to know the students. It also becomes, from a Freirean perspective, a point of consciousness for them, because you can begin shaping the classroom conversations such that they can begin relating to the issues in terms of, so the students in my, religion is a big deal, like in Louisiana, for instance. So when we began talking about shifts in families or shifts in cultures, the students would talk about shifts across generations in their own families, and then they would begin talking about how, if somebody talked about, say, an interracial relationship or something, the students might reach for how, my grandparents worshipped at this church, but then, this uncle or this aunt or this person broke away and began going to that church. So they began seeing kind of hybridities in their own micro ways. So that's one way. The other is I love to use films, videos, poems, because then that takes it away from you, the teacher. Like I've used, say, the work of Langston Hughes, for instance, African-American poet who really wrote quite strongly, critically about many issues. I don't know his entire but also, there was one, it's old now, there was one video called It's Elementary, Addressing Gay Issues in Elementary School or something like that. Now that little video, they show a faculty meeting where teachers' own resistance to addressing LGBT, and that time the discourse was not even at LGBT, it's old, it's almost 20 years old, this video. But using that in class, and then students get, like one student had said, Dr. Asha, my mom is a principal in Texas. She could never raise this issue in her school. I said, okay, maybe she could raise it with her administrators and request a special meeting where people just watch and discuss the video. So you kind of outsource it a little bit, those are some of the ways. But building up the support structures, it takes curriculum, it takes commitment from administration, it takes commitment from faculty, it takes the working through, and it takes a deeper analysis and how to I don't have the answer in terms of how to balance making changes within a classroom, a school, a university, a school district, along with the larger systemic. It's always uneven and choppy, but you kind of begin where you are, you begin somewhere.
Thank you very much for the talk, and thank you for mentioning the theories and the feminist ideas that you bring in and relating them to classroom experiences. It's making me think, and I'm still thinking about some things. But one experience that came to mind while I was listening to you is of teaching a course in gender and education here at this university. And what happens, I realized, in higher education in India is that young women from rural backgrounds seldom make it to higher education. They've dropped off the pipeline somewhere. Yeah. So what one ends up with in an elective on gender and education is young women from urban, usually metropolitan backgrounds, and young men from peri-urban or rural backgrounds who are interested in ideas of gender, perhaps from having seen what is happening in their own families, their own communities. And the two groups bring very different experiences to the classroom, because the kinds of personal experience of gender that a young woman might have in a metropolis is very different from what a young man sees in rural India. And one sees sometimes a kind of a frustration with each other between these two groups.
Last session today, one is in whatever ways we can, if we can offer, like, pedagogically safe spaces, not that we don't try, but I'm always trying to reach for new ways, new safe spaces. So for everyone to have a chance to speak out. So like one of the things, and I borrowed it from an old movie called Up the Down Staircase, which, so one of the things I offered to the 100 students today, because they don't know me, I'm just some random person here, and the professors have said, you have a speaker, So I offered to them, I said, if you don't want to come up and scribble on these whiteboards or raise your hand, you can send notes forward, right? So one thing would be we could require, or we could find ways to reach out such that the students whose perspectives remain on the margins for whatever sets of reasons have a way, and that there's safety, right? And we require the class to engage those. If there are films, documentaries, bring in guest speakers who can present something in the fashion of, say, a case study, right? Those are some of the things I know I've done. And then taking it out of the local context into some other context always helps. It's like using animal picture books with kids to talk about loss or whatever, rather than happening to real people. So if we can take it to some other context and then have them think about it. The other thing I've assigned to people too is generationally. I mentioned that earlier today too. I would say to students, go talk to your grandparents about their experience with such and this. And if you don't have grandparents, go to your neighbors and talk to talk to previous generations. And then they begin seeing that stories of shifts in cultures, etc., are not just some theoretical mumbo jumbo that the professors decided to talk about. Nonetheless, I am not dismissing or eliminating or in any way, you know, the very real struggle, right? And some of the kinds of assignments, I don't know how possible realistically they are, but here are my thoughts, is maybe to require them to go find at least one story in a newspaper, go out somewhere and connect or interview, and if they can't go out to rural parts, can they go out to maybe a slum community or a different linguistic community? I mean, they're all very different, but kind of push them into engaging that difference, you know? And the rethinking people again, I haven't used this in decades, I'm trying to remember it, but oh, this is so far back, so I'll look into the recording and say, don't take my word for it. But I think one exercise one of the school teachers did that they had written up was they had their, so we read it in class, but they had their students in class kind of role play in terms of being immigrants and who was allowed into the country and who was not. So, I mean, some such, depending on your class setting, right? Again, it's tough work, but it's good when we can find ways that engage, you know, and that's why I find Anzaldua so powerful, because really the shift needs to begin happening internally, not just through discourse, you know. Yes, sir, you...
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks a lot for the talk. I mean, it's been a while that I haven't actually heard a talk on the postcolonial and so on and so forth. I mean, I've worked in that field for a bit for a while and then so on and so forth. My question in some ways is the sort of, you know, the ethical and the political horizon that you're working with. Could you in some ways spell that out? I mean, and I'm in some ways echoing some of the critiques that have been actually made of the postcolonial school of thought and so forth. You know, I'm forgetting the names right now,
Okay.
you know, but the point simply is that this school of thought in some ways seems to go very well with all that you've actually critiqued as well as the other and so on and so forth. I mean, be it the corporate capital or the, you know, whoever, you know, who in some ways sort of begin to represent the big other who's exploiting and so on and so forth. I mean, so I'm just wondering as to what is the political and ethical, you know, view, so to speak? I mean, not just in the abstraction in some ways. I mean, you know, at some level, we don't know what justice means now. We don't know what, you know, I mean, especially in the Indian context now. I mean, when the left seems to have sort of discredited itself, you know, through its various sort of, you know, leftist governmental formations and so on and so forth, West Bengal or Kerala and so forth. You know, suddenly you have somebody like Amartya Sen walk in and speak a very particular language, almost as though he's an apologist for the sort of conservative of the right and so on, which he's not in some ways. I mean, he's sort of towing a tenuous line and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I'm just wondering as to, you know, what's the framework that you're working with in certain ways? I mean, on the one hand, I could hear you talk about the concrete ways in which you try and undo, you know, various modes of thinking, unlearning, et cetera, right? I mean, so that's one of the concrete ways in which we engage. But what's the larger picture we are looking at? You know, is it a lost battle already in some ways? Except that, except that in some ways, these are the only things we can do, and it's never going to form movement of any sort. It's always going to be capital, which is going to win out in the end. Or, so what exactly are we looking at in some ways is what I'm sort of, you know.
Yeah, I'm trying to like grasp the various threads you raised, and one thing I heard consistently was, you know, what's like the larger political picture, and then in terms of have we already lost the battle? Peter Taubman, the guy who raises all those questions and says, have we lost our way? How did we let financiers and corporate and whatever billionaires shape our agenda and so on? One of the things he said, either in that same book or in another piece, but he said, maybe sometimes there's nothing else that we can do for a while, you know. So I don't know about that. The way I honestly think about it, and I said it to students today during the break or at the end when a few of them came up and chatted. One of the students, somebody wrote, because I had them all scribbling, it was very generative, and somebody wrote about how systemic change can, I forget the exact words, but they said they had radical in quotation marks, it can't be radical, it must evolve. I know what I believe, honestly, just down to earth, not necessarily in terms of scholarly jargon or anything like that, is I think and believe that you should, my professors would say this to me, go to your strengths. Go to your strengths, right? Because if this is one of your strengths, this kind of, whatever kind of work, whatever kind of project, then you're going to do it well, you're going to do it with heart. So somebody else may be able to lead morchas or marches, somebody else may be able to get another policy level and try and shake things up from there. For me, one of the things that matters is through this, and what Gayatri Spivak has described, the slow changing of minds in her book, Other Asias. So I think that this for me is part, this meaning teaching classes in these ways is part of the grassroots work. Yesterday, Usha Rajaram, your colleague, Rajaram. So she and I were chatting about various things, and not the speaker, Usha Rajaram here. And so we were chatting about some things, and one of the things, you know, we both found ourselves almost saying in chorus that people who are doing this kind of work related to issues of equity and justice and representation and thinking about issues of race, caste, gender, so on and so forth, ultimately, wherever you are, in whichever context, there is kind of, we have friends, that there's an alliance. Your work is context specific. But really, it's that simple. That's where I come from, you know. I also think it's important to recognize, and we've talked about it in class and otherwise too, and I was also trying to make sure my paper at IISc last Friday and the paper today were not entirely congruent. They speak to each other, but I discussed more the issue of being implicated, right? So, we talked about this, and I mean, I have a Downton Abbey bag, for heaven's sakes, you know, so come on. So we recognize our own limits, we recognize our own implicatedness, and within that, how can we hold ourselves up to the rigor of doing work and with as much integrity, right? With as much integrity. So as far as I'm concerned, if somebody in my class, if a student is going to say something racist or homophobic or whatever, casteist or whatever, I'm going to address it. There is nothing namby-pamby will do. In terms of the rest of it, I mean, act or speak in any of those kinds of ways, any sexist, anything. But at the same time, if indeed we are supposed to begin with where the students are and build from there and work towards any kind of long-term change, it's very interesting to hear your students say, Dr. Asher, I went home and I, you know, said this to my families, and you know it's shaking up the families now because they are going in with these different perspectives, you know. So again, I think you have to go to your strengths and work with your commitments from where you are. The world is going to keep changing. We have to stay agile. I can't say that I'm very clear that I can't claim to be entirely, very thinly knowledgeable right now about the status of education in India. My reading is limited. My work has been elsewhere. This is a year of study for me. But that doesn't mean that the little I've read, I can't make sense of it, you know. So I think it's good to know the limits too. So I don't know if I'm really able to respond to the question you raised. But if we have a sense of our commitments and a sense of our strengths, I think that's from where we build. And politically, I don't know what else I could say to that. I do know that postcolonial scholars were suspect after 9/11. I am not so grand that I made it on any list of suspects, but they were suspect in the US. So I don't know what that means politically. Yeah.
A footnote to the Child Rights Convention and the US not signing it, and a terminology question query, I don't know. The footnote is, of course, that the official position is that since the US is a federal state, unless all the states repeal the death sentence for children less than, humans less than 18 years old, the US cannot possibly ratify the convention. In some states, for some crimes, apparently it's still legal for humans under 18 to be hanged or executed, death sentence. So that was the major objection, the official objection that the US had. Somalia, of course, is an entirely different story. The terminology question, I was just wondering, in the morning you opened up the diversity in your classroom, and today in the afternoon you opened up the diversity of the East through Kapoor's book. I'm just wondering whether the words East and West are useful anymore, even with scare quotes. Would it maybe perhaps, since they are such heterogeneous spaces, might it make sense in the way we are thinking about rural and urban as not being particularly useful labels anymore? There used to be more reliable shorthands not so long ago. They don't seem to be so. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
No, I think that's very nuanced and thoughtful, and I don't know that I've thought about it necessarily in terms of East and West quite that way, because yeah, I think it's a conversation that I would like to have in greater depth and think about more through the year and beyond. But there's definitely that blurring. We see that in Kapoor's book and even otherwise. At the same time, there's still something to do with setting agendas, with the flow of monetary control. Again, I'm not an expert in that area, but I wonder whether, I don't know, you're pushing me to think, because I've thought this of race. Like I've wondered about, at least in the US context, that how much longer, maybe at the most another 50 years, I don't know, but how much longer can the concept, the construct of race as it is, survive? And yet, in the age of Obama, it's really, really important to have a conversation around race, because there are people busy saying now we are in post-racial America when we are not in post-racial America. And then when I was in Louisiana, America. But when I was in Louisiana, oh, what was that town? Jenna, something. Anyway, there was, at some school, they either staged like a, oh, I'm blurring, I'd have to look it up. But either they staged like a mock hanging or a mock lynching or something ghastly like that at a school. So these terribly, it was in the 21st century, it's not old. The Jenna 6, it's coming back. Those were the headlines. I think it's Jena. But anyway, so my point too is that perhaps discursively we can break these down, and yet materially we really need to remain really vigilant, you know, because these horrific things are still happening. One quick note, and then we can move on. Like I was thinking about it when I was responding to your question too. One amazing film, and amazingly it was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, very, very Christian. So Baton Rouge had its first Jewish film festival a few years ago, somewhere in the early 2000s, and I happened to go to it. How many people have heard of a song called Strange Fruit over here? You have? Do you know what it is? It's about lynching. It's, ooh, I have goosebumps. It's this amazing song. Look it up. I have goosebumps. It would actually be a great teaching device, not necessarily for WGS. Ooh, it's really quite graphic and gory. And Billie Holiday, a crooner, made it very, very famous. People didn't know that okay, now I'm giving away the story, but I learned this through the film. I went to my department chair and I said, I want the money to buy this film, you know. Money there is scarce, you know, but in the land of plenty. But anyway, I managed to get the money to buy the film, and I've used it in classes since. But the song was written actually by a white Jewish high school teacher who was actually a communist in those times, in that era, in New York City. He'd never been to the South, and he wrote the song, just like your friend wrote about the 128 ways or whatever. He wrote the song with great insight about lynching, you know, without ever having been there. And it's interesting that this film, I can't remember the date, but it was early 2000s that the filmmaker made it and was presenting it. So I still think that we should be looking forward and at the same time be vigilant about, it's hard to have a definitive answer because, as you were saying, things are kind of muddying. Things are muddying. And in the muddying, what can escape unnoticed or what can get washed away unnoticed can be very scary.
In some ways, look at our own institution. Now, the money has come to us, at the material level out of our globalization context, where Mr. Premji has earned this and made the money available to do that. That is, there are many changes in the real world, but the change has to happen in the images in our heads. So it is through education and that we want to bring about change. And so that money out of globalization is getting used to hopefully work against globalization in terms of beating the inequities, beating the unjust practices, and so on. So here is another
Contradiction.
What looks like a paradox, but there it is.
Uh-huh.
I was a grad student and so forth, worked at
I think they want you to use the gizmo.
Yeah, I'm just trying to be as loud as I could be. So, no, I'm just wondering if the postcolonial studies in some ways needs a sort of a fresh, something. I mean, it seems to, and since you've been working in that area for the longest time and you're still working within that field and so forth, I raise this question to you. One is that, it had a particular kind of efficiency and efficacy for, critical epistemic and so on and so forth for quite some time. And in certain ways, perhaps it's been sort of taken up by other schools of thought and what have you. So it's sort of lost its steam, so to speak, somewhat. Does it in some ways need to re-energize itself? And if so, in what ways is it possible? I mean, one way is possibly looking at the work of someone like Partha Chatterjee, who sort of never lost track of thinking about capital, right? I mean, so he's thinking about it all over again, with his idea of the political society and so on and so forth. I mean, so do we need something like that? I mean, I find myself sort of distanced from its concerns as I've come and stayed here now for a while now, and so I'm suddenly like, what are those issues? Are they speaking to me here? Or in some ways, questions of absolute materiality, which in some ways it's not about culturalist modes of articulation, understanding, experiencing, and so on and so forth. But in certain ways, it seems to me that it's the capital which needs to be addressed, and thought about, and so on and so forth. So is that what, I mean, Spivak did that, but did that in a different sense. I mean, I still can't, understand the 3 essays she has on value, for instance. I mean, I've been trying for the longest time now. I mean, so is there a different mode in and through which one gets into it and tries to understand it? And
no, I mean, and I would need to, hear more about your own work and from where you came and what and where and how and when, the distancing or the disjuncture or whatever. But in terms of responding to the issue you raise, I mean, I think even within post-colonial discourse and theory, and I can't claim to have read every word that Spivak has written. I've tried to read Spivak. I need a dictionary to read. I tell my students this, I need a dictionary to read Spivak and Homi Bhabha. That way I can get them to read it too, when they know that the teacher needs a dictionary. It's okay for them to use one. It's necessary. I feel better that way. But, there are, as I mentioned this morning, because students raised also amazing questions, as I said, that post-colonial discourse itself has been critiqued by Leela Gandhi, by Chakrabarti, post-coloniality and the artifice of history. People are talking about the limits of post-colonial discourse. Edward Said wrote about representations and how media representations, even if we think they are ours, they are not really ours. We haven't yet found the language, right? So that's there. That said, I think some of the other questions that have come up too, I think are pushing, which is very exciting, they are pushing towards what next. and I don't know that I know what next. What I know is, for me this year, I feel grateful that the University of Minnesota and Fulbright have afforded me this opportunity for the first time in my X number of decades to have a chance to actually devote time to study. I think we need to listen to the world around us and think about what discourses and what practices might actually be proactive and might respond to what is to come. That doesn't mean I'm going to jettison what came, and I'm not saying that you're suggesting it, that I'm going to jettison what came before, right? So to me, Gloria Anzaldúa, who I don't know that she herself ever saw herself as a scholar, she was a poet, a writer, but postcolonial feminists have cited her work, many others have, and to me it still remains germane. Frantz Fanon, who was 26 years old and wrote his dissertation in French in 1952, it was published in 52, it's still in print. It's still in print. And I get it, the amputation, the dislocation, the white man's gaze framing, and I'm using white man's gaze because Fanon uses that language. Feminists have critiqued him, Paulo Freire, feminists have critiqued him. I find those works still powerful. Bell Hooks talks about, she writes faster than I can read. She does, but her early works that I read and I loved when I was a beginning graduate student, and I was like, wow, people can write like this. And she writes about home place. I've used that one. That's a great one, actually. Yeah, I've used that with my pre-service students too. Home place as a site of resistance, and she talks about how black women, in the face of slavery and oppression and indignities and working in the homes of white folks, they created the home place as a space of security and dignity and safety, however, humble it was. So to me, these works and these ideas remain powerful and can be translated, for instance, into some of the contexts you were raising, right? So where it goes next, I think, depends on our commitments, depends on what we are reading that the world is bringing to us, and the ways in which we see conversations around East and West, conversation around race, around rural, urban, how those conversations, how we can move those forward in theory and in practice. And I'm hesitating a little bit because I don't want to sound vacuous. It's kind of been a long day, and I don't want to find myself sort of mouthing trite remarks, because sometimes I hesitate. And you will notice in today, I didn't use the word policy, because I think those of us who are doing grassroots work or teaching in classrooms and engaging issues of equity and justice, it's very hard to influence policy. Because policy, even the administrators who sweep in and out of these public research universities come in, departments and colleges happen, are merged, they are doing what they think they need to do for the sake of the institution, for governance, yesterday Usha Ramanathan talked about governance. And here we are with this slow changing of minds. So really, I engage with postcolonial discourses, with the works of certain scholars. I think it's important to read old works, ones that speak to you. I think it's important to engage in new works and new cultures. As I said to the students today, I watched Doom 3 on the plane because these folks at the Minneapolis airport, I was having breakfast, 4 white people, 2 women, 2 men were sitting facing each other talking. I was having breakfast next to them. I couldn't help but overhear them. A little while, and I'm like, oh, these people are film studies scholars, because they were talking about film studies. And then the 2 guys begin talking about Doom. I'm like, what is this Doom? I'd never heard of Doom. Get on the plane, the big old antiquated Air India plane, and on the screen I find Doom 3. I had to watch Doom 3. But also, it was revealing to me, right? I've been hearing about it, but frankly, I told myself I'm doing my Bollywood homework. Now that sounds like a convenient excuse, but it isn't. I was actually really excited, and I was like, oh my God, Nina, in which century are you living? Because here is, what's that fellow's name, that pretty fellow? Amir Khan. So here he is, and with BMWs, James Bond meets something, all this action happening in Chicago. And this is the norm today, right? So if I'm drawing on Frantz Fanon and Gloria Anzaldúa and Gayatri Spivak and whoever's works, and I want to work with my diverse students, I can't pretend that they may not all be into Doom 3 at some level. And popular culture is so fluid and porous. It's very, very powerful. I don't know. I haven't been able to keep up with rap music or even that bubblegum music, that Britney and whatever, all those. I can't keep up with all that. At the same time, it's really, really important. I have my students, I will say to them, bring in a song, a poem if you want that you think speaks to it. So at least that way I get to learn and they get to relate. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm responding to your question. Past and present, here and there, and then looking ahead from that and building on the strengths that one brings, the knowledge that one brings, and the new conversations that one opens up, you know. I honestly, that's kind of the best response. I don't have the chutzpah to speak to